welcome to God is Open. I am your host, Christopher Fisher. Today on God is Open, we're going to be taking a look at this short clip about the moralistic fallacy. This is coming from the video Open Theist Critiques himself on Trinity Radio, and they talk about when it's not okay to use arguments that hinge on moral implications to sway the audience. And so there's an interesting discussion about that. So we're going to go ahead and hit play. This first clip is coming from the debate, and it is sped up. And so Tim Barber, who's speaking, sounds really, really fast because he's already a fast speaker.
Also said some pretty bafflingly incoherent things about decretalism. Decretalism is different from determinism because God enters into time in the incarnation. If God is decreeing all evil, then this is an attribute of God's that he's expressing in the creation. Ladies and gentlemen, James White believes that God is doing just that. I thought I'd run a little thought experiment. Let's replace the word determined in the following sentence with the word decreed and tell me if there's any substantive difference. God determined from eternity past that 50 million men, women, and children would be trapped in slavery on August 2nd, 2024, most of whom will die in captivity, never having heard the gospel, including thousands who will die today before the sun sets. Now let's read it again, but with the word decreed in there this time. God decreed from eternity past that 50 million men, women, and children would be trapped in slavery on August 2nd, 2024, most of whom will die in captivity, having never heard the gospel, including thousands who will die today.
All right. So this is what this is your version of what James White does. This is where y'all are both I guess I just have Chris Fisher in the back of my mind because
Yeah, Jonathan Pritchett is correct in what he's about to say.
he would say that both of y'all are engaging in what's called the moralistic fallacy. Like, oh no, if this is true, then this bad thing, isn't this awful? Therefore, we can't believe it because oh no, it's so bad. And White does this, and we'll get to that.
Yeah, so the moralistic fallacy is an informal fallacy. It's assuming that an aspect of nature which has socially unpleasant consequences cannot exist. Its typical form is, if X were true, then Z would happen. Thus, Z is false. That last phrase is typically unstated when people are using moralistic fallacy. They think that just saying something is bad and making people think that that's bad automatically assumes that whatever they're saying is true or false, depending. Basically playing on people's emotions in order to make a point or try to argue for a truth of a matter. And yes, that is exactly what Tim Barber is doing. It would not be a moralistic fallacy if he tied it to perhaps the Bible. So where the Bible says God is not the author of sin. So if the argument was in Calvinism, God does X, Y, Z, which would make him the author of sin, which is against or violates or somehow contradicts this biblical text. The biblical authors did not think this about God. That's a more logical flow to how you would structure an argument. But Tim Barber is going to argue that some things are prima facie, like God's goodness, and so the moralistic fallacy is not necessarily a moralistic fallacy if the implications are bad because of his assumptions about how God must be.
He did it all through his closing statement that if God doesn't have certain absolute knowledge, oh no, and so this is just both of y'all playing into the moralistic. Like, look how bad this would be if this was true.
Well, I mean, it's one of those. If I may, just real quick, I in my mind, it's like this is perfectly valid. If someone drags you into the muck of the pig pen, all right, time to start playing like we're just going to play like that.
So Nick Quint is absolutely right about this. So if this is the type of strategy and tactics that James White employs, it's fair to employ those same strategies no matter how fallacious back against him. And James White is getting his just dues. And so Quint says this multiple times in multiple different ways. He's absolutely right in everything he's saying.
It's like Dr. White has been saying this sort of stuff for forever. And so in my mind, it's like, well, if we're going to argue like this, if we're going to be silly about it, then let's sack up and do it. Let's go.
Yeah, but this came out. I get that for normal people, this has emotional persuasiveness to it. And your capital, and in his closing statement, White's capital, oh no, if open theism is true, then God doesn't know this, and how bad would that? But this.
Yeah, moralistic fallacies are popular because they are effective. People think on an emotional and intuitive level and not a logical level. And so in a debate, talking in terms of moralistic fallacies, making moralistic fallacies for your own side, it reaches a lot of people.
This was where
even though it's a
both
fallacy.
of y'all had me checking out, because it was like, and White tried this, and I guess because he didn't get, I don't know, but he was trying to say yes to all of these when you kept trying to say, and you were like, no, we got to go through all of these horrible things on your view. And do you think
That was actually a really funny part of the debate, where James White is forced to publicly state his answers to very incriminating sentences, and he's just, because Tim Barber's here smiling, giving a little smirk, he knows what's what. And what the funny thing in the debate is, Tim Barber was like saying that we shouldn't argue like this and you need to focus on scriptures, but then he goes ahead and does that anyways. And some of the commenters point that out. It's like, he kind of violated his own debate rules. And yeah, that's true. He kind of did that tongue in cheek, maybe, where he's violating his focus, what he stated he's going to focus on, to go into some of these moralistic fallacies. But if you have a Calvinist and you got their hands tied, making them walk through the humiliation ritual might be just worth it.
think that these kind of emotional arguments land as with most people besides me?
Certainly, I've seen hundreds of comments to the effect that this was what most.
Yeah, so Tim Barber is correct. People think on an emotional level. These emotional arguments are made because they are effective. And Braxton Hunter, he's going to point out that David Paulman, in he says that the moral argument for God is a terrible argument, but it appeals to so many people. So how do you judge an argument? By its logical merits or by its effectiveness? By its effectiveness, these are very good arguments. Maybe not by the logical consistency or intellectual content, but they resonate with people on a visceral level.
Convince them to consider it. Now, I'll also push back and say that not every statement of moral implications that we ought to be afraid of or ought to be concerned about is a moralistic fallacy. Not everything that is describing the second and third order consequences is in moral terms is a moralistic fallacy. So,
well, fair enough. But I'm just saying the general.
And so Tim Barber, I think he misunderstands the moralistic fallacy. So you need to actually tie those conclusions to something legitimate or concrete, like God is not the author of sin. And if you describe a situation, your view makes God the author of sin, which violates this verse. Therefore, the authors of this verse did not assume the type of theology that you're importing. And of course, they would counter-argue and maybe try to say, oh, that's not exactly what they meant when they had said this sort of thing, but that's where your logical arguments actually come in. It's not prima facie that you have to portray God in this good light, and if he's not portrayed in this good light, then it's not a moralistic fallacy. That's not how these things work.
General tenor of the whole thing is, oh, this is true, then this would be awful. Look how bad this is.
I mean, Pritchett, Dr. White has been doing this for, how old is he? Since he popped into the world.
Yeah, he does the same thing. I'm just saying.
Here's the thing, Pritchett. Like, that is the tenor that James White has established for 30 years of ministry. That is how he argues. In my mind, it is perfectly justified to play with the tools he has already basically.
Yeah, Nick Quint is absolutely correct. And you see him kind of smirking while he's saying these things. He's saying James White is getting his own medicine, and he's getting it double against him for all his years of being a bad faith actor. Quint is correct.
Put out in the open. Now, obviously, you and me, like, not to be rude, Tim. I heard all that. Yeah, okay, yeah, I'm gonna, no offense. All right, yeah, I know where that's going, so I'll check out. But I mean, for those who don't see that, Pritchett, you know, because you and I are super nerds who have nothing better to do than work out, eat meat, and read books. The average person who doesn't think or doesn't have those issues kind of settled, it's a shot across the bow to get them to wake up. So I think it's valid in the sense of offering a kind of a, I don't know, my dad used to do this when I was, flick you on the forehead. Oh, you got my full attention. Get people to kind of consider it. Now,
yeah, Quint is highlighting another aspect of this type of argumentation is it might spur the individual to second guess their priors and then research and come to better informed conclusions. He's also correct there.
Now, if that's as deep as they go with it, then shame on them. But, you know, in my mind, it's perfectly valid to use it as a flick on the forehead and a rhetorical device to basically show Dr. White, all right, you set the match. Let's start.
Yeah, I mean, he just that was his whole closing statement was, "Oh no, look how awful this would be." It was the chosen by God preface of R.C. Sproul. One stray molecule will just wreak havoc over God's. I'm just like, okay.
So the issue here is ascribing morality to something that is morally neutral. In fact, that's what makes something a moralistic fallacy. If we say
that is incorrect. That's a misunderstanding and misstating of the moralistic fallacy. The moralistic fallacy is if something is socially undesirable, then it's not true. That's the moralistic fallacy. It's not about assigning morals to something that's morally neutral. That's not what the moralistic fallacy is.
For example, that God, being the determiner of all things, would make him the author of evil. Oh no, that's so horrible. That's not a moralistic fallacy. That's an accurate moral argument describing an entailment of the statement. Right?
If you accept that premise,
but if we assume.
Yeah, Pritchett is right and Barber's wrong. That is a moralistic fallacy to say, hey, then God would be the author of evil. Because implicit in that is, therefore we shouldn't believe it because it does make God the author of evil. He hasn't tied it to the verse in which God does not author sin or done anything to establish the premise that God is not the author of evil within the Bible or within reality.
Assume that, well, sure, the premise would need to be borne out, right, but that doesn't make it a moralistic fallacy. If we say that, again, I hear Chris Fisher in my mind. He's coming up a lot for someone who's not even in the country right now. But I hear Chris Fisher in my mind too, saying, you know, that people who engage in like greatest possible being conversations say, well, the greatest possible being would obviously have a pink hat, right? And then this other person says, well, no, clearly the greatest possible being would actually have two pink hats. And all this greatest possible being discussion just becomes a discussion of what people's preferences would be and what they think the greatest. The first guy says, no, if the greatest possible being has two pink hats, then that would make him a two hat being. And wouldn't that be so horrible? And that's morally neutral. Yeah. The moralistic fallacy is ascribing morality to something that's morally
I think Barber's mixing up a few things. A greatest being theology is just trying to maximize God. And so my example is always with, you add hats. Oh, if one hat's good, two hats is better. A God with three hats must be better than a God with two hats. And not the moralistic fallacy. It's a dignum Deo fallacy. What is fitting of God? Just because we conceptualize subjectively what God must be like and try to maximize that conception, that doesn't mean our thoughts have anything to do with reality. They don't transfer into reality our good thoughts and ideas. But anyways, we are going to go ahead and close there. The moralistic fallacy is when you appeal to negative consequences or socially undesirable consequences, and as such, challenge the premise, because the premise will lead to those undesirable consequences. And so if you like this mini cast, just leave a comment or start a thread on God is Open Facebook group. Thank you for listening.